Going into round 12, the penultimate round of the Tata Steel tournament, Wesley So held a half-point lead over Wely, and they played in round 12. Wesley So had white, and he took no chances at all, played very solidly, as did Wely, and this game ended in a draw, which meant that the chasing pack had a chance to try and gain some ground. So Magnus Carlsen, for example, he had black against Pavel Eljanov. Well, the opening did not turn out very well for him, and you can see in this position Eljanov has a very promising endgame. This is the position after 28 moves. They'd arrived in this endgame straight out of the opening, and here, well, Eljanov has this very nice pawn center supporting the knight on e6. Here Eljanov chose to exchange on e4, which turns out to be a mistake, but here if he just withdraws that knight to d4, making sure it can't be exchanged off, well, he dominates the position. So c5 is threatened, pawn to c5. So if the knight blockades, now, I mean, there's a couple of good moves. My machine likes the look of knight c6. It's rather complicated, but seems better for white. I like the look of rook b6, threatening to play knight b3, exchanging off that knight, which really holds black's position together on the queen side, and looks to me as though white is doing extremely well. Certainly black has no winning chances here at all. In the game, Eljanov took on e4, which also at first glance looks very promising, but suddenly this bishop came into the game and things are not so clear. Let's just go on a couple more moves. So material is even. This is quite a crunch moment in the game, actually. It's an interesting trap. Of course, white would very much like to take that pawn here, but then bishop h3, mate is threatened. I tell you, the power of rooks and bishops. So this rook has to come back to defend on the first rank. Well, this is now checkmate. Very powerful. So Eljanov had to play rook b3 to prevent bishop h3. And suddenly Carlsen had found his feet. The position is still about even, but little by little Carlsen made progress. Suddenly he got to a rook and pawn endgame where he was a pawn up, still very difficult to win, but he managed to convert it. We know that Magnus has incredible stamina, and it really paid off in this game. So Magnus gained a bit of ground, just half a point behind the leader Wesley So. And the other player in the chasing pack was Carlsen and Aronian, who played white against the tail-ender Luc van Wely, and this went very quickly into a Zamish variation of the King's Indian. And Carlsen likes to play with knight e2. c5 is the normal move here, but Luc kind of went his own way with a6. I mean, this is not a bad way to play with b5. It's still very tricky. You chip away at white's centre, and sometimes you can take on c4 and play d5, that's an option. But Luc went for another way, rook b8, an interesting move. So you want to take, and obviously there's a bit of pressure on b2. Queen d2 looks normal here for white, but Carlsen played rook f2. A little bit unusual, so it means that if this pawn is taken here, then the rook defends b2 laterally. Queen c7 from Luc, still not sort of going into a typical King's Indian. You know, of course you could perhaps play e5 here, but Queen c7 just kind of bides time and just sees what white is doing. But rook c1 looks very normal opposite the queen. And now Luc goes for a slightly unusual plan, taking the pressure off white's centre, but the knight has to go to the side of the board. And now we reach a kind of Benoni position. Okay, let's just go on a few more moves. Rook e8 is an important move because you want to prevent white advancing with f4 and e5, so there's just a bit of pressure on this pawn. So knight b6 clears that away. Now let's look at the pawn structure. This will determine middle game plans. So white has this lovely pawn chain, typical Benoni structure, this pawn chain, and black has this pawn chain here and a queenside pawn majority. Difficult for white to advance through the middle. Aronian plays bishop h6, so what he wants to do is exchange off bishops, and that will weaken black's king. You notice that black's queen is across the other side of the board, so it makes a lot of sense for Aronian to weaken the king side, and you know, this queen could join in the attack, possibly an h-pawn as well at some point. Here, well, Aronian said afterwards that he thought it would be best for black to gain counterplay on the queen side straight away by advancing with a5 and a4, or a5 and maybe bishop a6 and a later a4, and that does look logical. Although, you know, this is a very, very complicated game in prospect. White, of course, will play h5 to try to open the king position. But, well, before this, bishop h8 was played. This is probably a good move, actually. Probably better than a5, retaining this bishop. And now here, Aronian thought for 25 minutes. Difficult to know what to do. I mean, I'd still perhaps like this idea of playing h4 and h5 just to chip away at black's king position. Knight f1 also possible, looking to get into the c4 square. That looks very logical to me. But Aronian played h3, slightly mysterious move. Yeah, here is where a5 is probably correct in this position. That's what Aronian thought he should do, a5 and bishop a6. So why did Aronian play h3? Well, it's to cover the g4 square, so that if white ever manages to get f4 in, then yeah, g4 is covered. But at the moment, f4 simply isn't possible because the knight can take. Luke played bishop d7. A little bit slow. Bishop c4. And bishop b5. Yes, if a5, then I mean, one plan for white might be just to play in a very single-minded way rook e2, protecting the e-pawn, and then f4 going for e5. That is possible, and then you can see the justification for playing h3 to cover the g4 square. Bishop b5 played. King h1. Okay, a careful move. And here again, I think a5 has to be tried to gain counterplay. You know, you want to try and open the a file and get a rook into the position. I certainly didn't like this move, queen d8. I understand why Luke wants to try and perhaps bring the queen over to the king side to protect, but bishop g5 is a very annoying pin. And probably the queen should just come back again. Instead, Luke went rook b7, and now queen f4 is rather nasty. This pressure on the f6 knight is, well, it's so uncomfortable for black now. Queen h4, just switching over, and now white is ready to advance through the middle. And this is, I think, in practical terms, this is now lost, actually. Luke tried queen e5. Of course, he would love to get some activity for this queen, but rook d2 is a good move, covering the d4 square. And now, instead of recapturing with the rook, which would allow the queen to come down here, f4 immediately by Levon. This is very sharply played. Levon are very, very aware of what's going on in the position. If the queen retreats, then of course it just walks back into this horrible pin. Probably you can just take and on the next turn push forward the e5. So Luke went for it. He tried to complicate with queen takes pawn, giving his queen, well, at the first glance it doesn't look so bad. At the moment black has 2 minor pieces for the queen, and you know this rook is en prise. Suddenly you might think, well, black is very active here, but Levon controlled this beautifully. Rook e1, and now f5. This is great. So this allows the bishop to cover here. I mean, this is a horrible position now. If pawn takes pawn, you can just take the bishop. If bishop takes pawn, then you take the rook. White is just too much material up now. Luke took the rook. Bishop takes, and now watch those dark squares. Very nice sacrifice. Well, it's not really a sacrifice. Just getting rid of that knight to get the queen in. Rook takes allows check, and a very neat checkmate. Bishop takes, and now the queen comes in, and of course this is just forced checkmate. We've seen it millions of times before. Bishop h6 coming and mate. Luke tried bishop takes pawn, a bit desperate. If king takes, then rook e2 check. So Levon, after precisely 3 seconds, stepped to the side, and Luke had to resign as there is simply no defense to bishop h6 and queen g7 mate. So a very efficient finish from Levon Aronian. When it comes to checkmating attacks, he is absolutely deadly. Well, that meant that Levon had gained ground on Wely, so that means going into the last round, we have Wely So on 8 out of 12. Then 3 players on 7.5, Carlsen, Aronian and Wely. So we're heading for a dramatic final round in Vaikanze. Wely So has black against Nepomniachtchi. Not an easy one for him. And Wely doesn't like to take too many risks. I suspect that'll be safety first, and I suspect Wely will make a draw, which could give the others a chance to catch up. Aronian has black against Andreikin. Wely has white against Wojtaszek, and Carlsen has white against Karjakin. Now that's a fantastic duel for the final round. So situation wide open with 1 round to play.